In this video, I'll be covering early Scandinavian history and the origins of the different Scandinavian peoples that would eventually become the Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians we know today, as well as some of the people who used to live in Scandinavia but were either expelled or assimilated. The first people in Scandinavia arrived somewhere between 10,000 and 8,000 BC, settling in what would become Denmark and some of southern Sweden. This is also around when the first known Scandinavian person was found, who was buried in Denmark near the city of Odense. These people, and perhaps others who migrated from elsewhere, continued to settle Scandinavia, and by the Nordic Bronze Age is around when we begin to have some notion of who the people living in Scandinavia were, namely the early Norse people, or if you want to be more accurate, the early Germanic people who would become the Norsemen, Germans, Anglo-Saxons, and many others. In around 750 BC, these people lived mostly in Scandinavia, but by 500 BC, they had begun spreading south into Central Europe. The Germanic people would spread further and further south during Roman times and begin to diverge culturally and linguistically from their Norse cousins back in their homeland. But this is when history becomes a little less fuzzy, as the Romans did have some trade with the Germanic and Norse people, and we have some, admittedly limited, historical records. So let's go over who these people were and where they lived. First, I'll cover the groups which no longer exist today, as they have either been expelled or assimilated into other cultures. In Götaland, in modern Sweden, lived the Geets. The region Götaland is in fact named after them. The Geets were one of the last lost Scandinavian people to be completely conquered. Historians believe they were separate from Sweden and the Swedes during most of the Viking Age. We know there were several kings of the Geets and that they fought many wars with the Swedes. The historian Jordanus described the Geets as being a nation which was very bold and quick to engage in war, but other than that we don't know much about them. Historians don't quite agree on when they were conquered by the Swedes, but it probably happened somewhere between 900 and 1000 AD, although we know they weren't completely assimilated into Sweden before the 1200s. There are many theories as to why and how the Swedes conquered the Geets. One is that it started as a union of sorts, to defend against the more powerful Danes just to the south. Another is that the Swedes simply conquered it, as we do know the Geets and Swedes fought many wars. The Geets were involved in the Gothic Wars in southern Europe, which brought back lots of wealth, but also naturally depleted their numbers. This could have given the Swedes an ideal opportunity to conquer them. Further west in Jutland and modern Germany, there were the Geets, Angles, and Saxons. These are often looked at as more German than Norse people, but I would say that the distinction is pretty arbitrary, as these people all had similar languages, culture, and religion to their Norse cousins. And the Germanic languages at this time were very likely in a dialect continuum, meaning that there were no clear linguistic borders, but rather just blurry lines where the languages and dialects slowly transitioned. We also know that Anglo-Saxon was mutually intelligible with Old Norse, which does show us that the Geets, Angles, and Saxons must have spoken very similar languages to the Norse. Of course, as I just alluded to, these people would go on to settle England, but back home in Jutland and mainland Europe, they would eventually be conquered or fizzle out into obscurity. The Geets would eventually be conquered and influenced by the Danes at around 200 AD. The Angles would face the same fate later, and the Saxons would eventually convert to Christianity and be influenced more by their more distinct southern Germanic neighbors, making North Germanic or Norse and continental West Germanic more distinguished from one another. Now that we've covered the lost peoples of Scandinavia, let's go over the ones that inhabit the region today. The origins of the Danes are not very well known. There are essentially two main hypotheses. The first one is that they came from somewhere in modern Sweden, likely Götaland or Skåneland, and went on to conquer the Heruli tribe to the south. The Heruli were another Germanic group and are thought to have been East Germanic, but according to this theory, they were eventually expelled by the North Germanic Danes, who would make Skåne and the Danish islands their homeland, forcing the Heruli to flee south. Another theory is that the Danes were the native inhabitants of Zealand and Skåneland, and simply expelled the Heruli minority that lived there. Historical records and evidence from this extremely early point in Scandinavian history are not the most reliable or certain. So the Danes either came from what is today southern Sweden and expelled the Heruli from Skåneland and the Danish islands, or they actually just originated from Skåneland and the Danish islands. but despite their origins, they made the Danish islands and Skåne their homeland, and went on to conquer the Geets and Angles, creating what would be the Danish realm for centuries to come. This Danish realm would have consisted of several petty kingdoms, which generally would have ruled over either Jutland, Zealand, or Skåne. The entire Danish realm would eventually be united by King Harald Bluetooth in the 900s AD, making it the most populous and influential Scandinavian power till the Treaty of Roskilde 700 years later. The Swedes were a Norse or North Germanic people originating from the region around modern Stockholm in what is called Svealand, meaning land of the Swedes. They would fight many wars with the neighboring Geets and eventually either unite with them to counter the Danes or conquer them between 900 and 1000 AD. The Geets would be completely assimilated into Swedish culture by the 1200s, creating the historical Swedish homelands. From here, the Swedes would expand north and east by conquering the Finns and Sami people. Although, as we know from Finland existing today, they would only completely settle and assimilate the far north where the Sami lived. Although there is still a Swedish-speaking minority present in Finland, a remnant of the Swedish expansion to the east. We have little to no information on the Norwegians' very early history, but we know Norway was settled by Germanic people, likely coming from Sweden and Denmark. Unlike with Sweden and Denmark, we don't have the story of which specific groups came to dominate the region, and Norwegians generally just seem to have been referred to as Norsemen, hence the name Norway and Norwegians. But we do know Norway, just like Sweden and Denmark, was split between many petty kingdoms during the Viking Age. King Harald Fairhair is the monarch credited with first unifying Norway in the late 800s, but Norway would go through many periods of being split between petty kingdoms, unifying, and being conquered by the Danes and Swedes. As we all know, after and while these realms were being united, these Norse people would begin to explore and conquer across Europe, even traveling as far as the Eastern Roman Empire to the south and North America in the west. The Danish Vikings even managed to conquer most of England. But the Vikings are a story for another time. So that's all for now. I hope this brief overview of the lost peoples of Scandinavia and the origins of the Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians was interesting. I plan on doing more informative videos in the future, so if you enjoy this video format, please leave a like and let me know. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more of my history content in the future. See you in my next video.